Hello Internet, and welcome to the Collective Arcana. We are a channel all about tabletop gaming, and today we're going to do a little bit of homebrewing. I'm going to talk about how you should go about homebrewing a deity for your homebrew campaign. Hey everyone, if you like our content, don't forget to subscribe. It really helps out the channel, lets us know what you want to see, and lets you see when we post new things. Everybody wins. So there are several approaches when you are building a deity. You'll usually come at them from one of two sort of primary ways, though. You'll either be creating a whole lot of deities for a pantheon, maybe you're just creating your homebrew world, or maybe you're just adding a new set of deities within that homebrew world. Or the alternative is maybe you're just adding a single deity for some specific reason, either to an existing pantheon in a non-homebrew world, or adding one to your homebrew pantheon. I do this pretty often in my homebrew. It's a pretty big world, and I've already got a lot of established deities covering a lot of things, but I do sometimes have players come to me with a character idea, a concept that they want to have some religious aspect to it, some sort of bent in that direction, but none of the deities that I have open to them are really exactly hitting what they want. Now, we could, and we often do, sometimes just find a new way of looking at an existing deity, or just sort of lean into the conflicts that they might have with their own deity. But sometimes, and it's actually happening several times all at once in my next campaign, but sometimes I will sit down with a player and say, okay, let's find exactly the deity that works for you. And so we will sort of go back and forth, hash out a overall concept for that deity, and then I will go back and I will, on my own time, away from them, I will find out the specifics of it, making sure to hit all the notes that were important to my player, and then making any sort of secret things to make it a little more interesting. They don't know exactly everything about their deity, but also to fit it into my world the way that it might need to layer in a few little tweaks here and there to make sure that it can exist peacefully and coexist alongside any other lore that I've been building up with other deities or just other parts of the world. And that's really the easy way, is when you've already got an established pantheon, again, whether something pre-published or something that you've made up yourself years ago and been working on over time, it's pretty easy to just slot a new deity in, a unique combination of domains and concepts and things like that, and then, just find a place to fit it in the world, find some followers, that sort of thing. When building an entire pantheon, of course, you want to hit quite a few staples sort of ideas. Things so that most players coming to your table will have, you're going to have a good domain god, light domain healing, that sort of classical god. You may not actually, but if you're not going to, then you need to, sort of have that idea and sort of build a pantheon around not having that deity, because sometimes the deities that you don't have are just as important as the deities that you do have in terms of setting the tone of your world and the types of characters that your players can make. And hey, if you're doing these classic staples, you don't necessarily have to hit those notes exactly right. You might have a deity for war, for creation, for any number of classical sort of tropes and the domains associated there. But that doesn't mean that you have to stick perfectly to those tropes. So you might have a deity of the sea who actually is also sort of a patron deity over artists, because your deity of the sea loves sea shanties and they sort of go hand in hand in a strange way. So, don't be afraid to do a little bit of customization, a little bit of tweaks there, both to make your world feel a little more unique, a little more lived in, instead of perfectly cookie cutter, fitting all the expectations, but you're still getting those big ideas that most of your players want to see. The other big challenge with a pantheon is making it cohesive. We talked about the deities that are there and aren't there can be really important to the tone, but you also will have certain ways that they're expected to be able to interact. And I don't necessarily mean huge, massive conflict, like deities going to war sort of thing, but you should at least have, the jealous younger brother who has eyes on the older brother and what they have domain over, and, bickering siblings are a classic in pantheons, but also, jilted lovers, any number of things like that. Your deities, they should have sort of familial ties, but also, for good and ill. but also, ties to other deities, especially if you have multiple pantheons within your game. Then you really start to ask questions, especially on those, some cultures and their respective pantheons may not have a lot of overlap, but sometimes they can sort of butt up. And so then you have to ask the question, well, does this god of war and this, god of war, do they get along? Are they sort of kind of the same deity masquerading between the two groups? Just because that's a fun way to create strife as well, playing both sides just to create war, if that's the type of war god that you have. But also, other ideas of, just they saw a place where they could get more followers, and so they just put on a different helmet. That's very much like the Roman and Greek sort of idea, where, it's a very meta version of it, but this idea that these deities say, oh, okay, over here they call me this, I'm a little bit different, but I'm, whatever, I'll answer to either one. Whoever's calling me, whoever's, burning the right kind of incense, whatever, I'll listen to. Regardless of, why you're building your deities, you're going to want to make sure that they fit the requirements so that your players can use them to all the types of effect that they would expect from an official deity. The best way to do that is to actually find a list of official deities. I play Pathfinder 2nd Edition, so the Gods and Magic book is a great resource for how to build a bunch of pantheons, because it lists several pantheons, how they interact, as well as just giving you a bare minimum breakdown for a lot of deities that aren't featured heavily in the book. They just have charts and charts and charts of just the specific bare minimum info you need to create a deity. And from there, you can really just sort of say anything else is just your flavor text. And that's good. That gives you a lot of room to work while making sure that you're hitting the minimum notes that you need to for your players to use your deities. And you don't need to decide everything all at once. In fact, if you're going this approach, if you're going this creating a pantheon, wanting to make sure you're filling these roles approach, you may come back to a lot of these ideas. You may fill out a couple of, 2 of the primary domains and come back and fill out a few other domains once you've gotten an idea for how all the deities interact and how they interact with the world. You don't want to hammer anything in, as always when you're homebrewing. You want to leave yourself some wiggle room to change your mind, go back. Sometimes you'll get a brainstorm and you'll say, well, what about if this deity, the way that they interacted in the past, with these people or with this other deity, maybe I want to have them seem like this sort of deity, but also just throw in this weird domain, and now I need to explain why they have that weird domain, either with a myth, anecdote sort of thing, or just really drive it home as part of their character and find a way to link these two maybe disparate ideas. A big thing to take into account is who follows this deity. Whether it's a culture or a set type of ancestry that typically follows it. Of course, there are going to be, outliers. There are going to be people who have heard of it in distant lands, or people who were born in one culture but really liked, maybe they're from a culture that typically doesn't favor art, but they're particularly artistic. So of course they may, gravitate towards your artistic deity, even though it's not the typical default deity for their, for even their pantheon, or just the primary deity for their culture. You may also want to think about, who follows this deity and why, what ancestries maybe, or, just cultures, revere this, maybe just certain professions really like certain deities, however you're going to break it down and figure out who and where this worship occurs. And then you got to think, for this particular deity, are they accepted, or are their followers seen as a crazy cult? And are they actually a crazy cult, or are they just misunderstood? Just a great example is that, some deities can be pretty evil overall, but might still be able to function perfectly in society. You might have a deity of commerce who just acknowledges, we're in this for profit. Profit should be your driving goal, but there's no reason to do it underhanded. There's no reason to do it evil. We're trying to profit. And as long as everything's working out, we don't really care how that happens. But we're not going to, we believe in the structure of the law and the rules and the regulations, so we're going to fit within that. But again, our driving goal is still profit, so versus a deity who is totally good and believes less, they're still going to be a commerce type deity, but they're more about how the way that commerce can be used to spread and uplift the entire group sort of thing. So not to get into too, political concepts there, but just as an idea of two different ways that, a similar domains and a similar type of deity might be viewed both within society and might view its place in that society. If an entire group, whether it's a city or a culture or even an ancestry, if an entire group is typically associated with the deity, or vice versa, deities is typically associated. It's a subtle difference, but it's an important one sometimes. But you want to figure out why. What's a fun, interesting anecdotal story for that connection? Where did this group, were they in a battle or something, a famine, some time of great hardship, and they called out and then got an obvious response from that deity, and so they just took off from there and said, well, that's the one that's looking out for us. That's our god. So you want to think about where those connections initially came from, even if, and this is a great homebrewing tip, even if you never tell your players the why of something, if you know the why, it's going to improve your chances to ad-lib in the moment. If somebody asks a question, even though you're not going to tell them this story, about this great famine and things like that, but it might still inform how you're going to answer questions that you are willing to answer, and that might provide clues to your players so that they can pursue that lead if they want to and go, I wonder what this story is about, and then look into it. Or they might just continue on. Either way, by having those ideas that you don't necessarily share, you're creating consistency whenever your players ask about it. So again, even if you're not going to tell your players why these associations are the way that they are, you should at least have some bullet point notes about, the types of founding events that created these connections. If you don't want to create a deity or a pantheon whole cloth, for inspiration, you can definitely look to real-world myths and legends. Something popular to draw upon would be Greek or Norse or Egyptian mythology. Those are sort of common, not necessarily that a lot of people are historical scholars on them, but you've probably seen a movie referencing those deities, or played a video game, or seen a special on the History Channel, whatever it may be, right? Most people have probably had some exposure to those. But then, there are some rarer ones too, but don't be afraid to jump into those more commonly known ones, because you're going to be able to use the tropes and the associations that your players already have as sort of shortcuts to explain what this deity is about, and really help them immerse more if it's an easy concept for them to grasp. Like, for example, you might say, oh, this deity, she's like Anubis, but, and then you go on, but by giving them that baseline reference to Anubis, they are like, okay, well, I'm vaguely familiar with Anubis, I sort of get this deity shtick. But if you want to go something a little more obscure, you want to create a more mysterious deity, then you can go to some of the more obscure myths and legends, things that are outside of those really common ones. So, maybe you're going to reference, Aztecs or ancient Sumerian or whatever it may be. Now, of course, what is common myths and legends can vary for any number of degrees. But, when I'm using these terms, I'm asking, has Ubisoft made a video game about them? Is one of the deities from that mythology helping out the Avengers, sort of thing. One thing to be careful about, you don't want to take inspiration from a still widely held religion. There are a whole lot of reasons why you wouldn't want to do that, but just it can be a little bit insensitive, especially if you handle it wrong, and if it's not your culture, you're probably going to handle it wrong. Just sort of assume that. If you want to borrow some concepts and themes, sort of loosely translated from those, that's probably okay. When in doubt, you should probably always consult with someone that who knows that culture or that religion, and ask, hey, would it be insensitive if I did this? And if you feel awkward asking them that, then that probably tells you maybe you should reassess that idea. Or if you just think to yourself, oh, I don't know anybody from that culture to ask about that, that's another good indicator. Maybe you shouldn't go down that road. But again, if it's something loose and it's just, themes and concepts, handle it sensitively, you're probably going to be okay. But just when in doubt. Personally, like I said, I like to mix and match, so I like to have some common tropey deities so that my players can have some standard expectations, especially because I like to introduce a lot of new players to the game. So I want them to have things that they can latch onto, easy ideas. I also like to pick from some more obscure sources for my inspiration to find some deities that, you know, might not have any obvious allegories to them, either in popular culture or in other tabletop games. And the reason is because that gives an air of mystery and strangeness to a deity. If, you know, they're not just like, oh, well, that's just Thor. This guy's just talking about Thor. It's just a little bit weirder and a little harder for them to get a sure grasp on what that deity's about, and just makes it feel a little more murky and ideally a little less trustworthy. Now to actually build everything out. You know, we've got our ideas and our inspiration, and we've got some idea that we need to be careful about interactions and things like that. We could not go into exactly how you should create deities in your game and how those interactions are going to look. You know, hopefully you've got some ideas, you've got some creation myths and things that you've been thinking about. And if not, then just adapt an existing pantheon. There's no shame there. You can definitely have your own universe using deities that are seen elsewhere. Now, your choice of game is going to determine exactly what is the bare minimum mechanical information you need to know about your deity. Again, I play Pathfinder 2nd Edition primarily, so for me, it's a pretty short list, actually, of the things that I need to have for my deities. They need a name, of course. I need to determine their follower alignments. Those will typically be within one step in either direction on the lawful, chaotic, and the good and evil scale. You know, one step in any direction on both of those, that little cross. I also need to select some edicts and anathema. Typically, you want to do about 2 to 3 each, depending on how wide those edicts and anathema are. If it's something that's really hard to avoid, 1 might be good enough. You know, like, you do not use coin. That's a weird, really hard one to get by with, probably, especially at lower levels. So, you know, you might not have too many anathema if something big like that is one of them. Pathfinder 2nd Edition has a background called Raised by Belief. And so each deity has to have an associated ability score, 2 ability scores, in case a player is using that background. So you want to pick 2 favorite ability scores for them to choose from when they're getting that background. You're also going to choose a divine font. Pathfinder 2nd Edition, clerics have a divine font. It's a series of sort of bonus spell slots they can use only to prepare heal or harm. Some deities will let you pick one or the other. Most of them that aren't neutral deities will make you choose particularly one or the other. So, you know, it's a decision you make at first level and are set with. You know, with some deities locking you in to heal or some to harm, and then others, when you select your deity, when you're building your character, you choose which is yours. You will also need a divine skill, that is a skill favored by the deity, and a favored weapon. This is mostly important for war priests because they get some extra proficiencies and or boosts when using those favored weapons. You'll want to assign some domains. These are sort of the, you know, the areas of purview, the specialties of that deity, what they're associated with. There's a whole lot of them in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. You know, there's a whole lot of them in D&D 5e. So just go through. You typically want to find things that make sense together. But you may have a very contradictory deity, and that's totally okay as well, as long as you're able to form some sort of cohesive mythology around it. Don't be afraid to have some opposing ideas in domains. Don't be afraid to reuse domains. You know, most deities don't have an exclusive lock on any particular domain, but, you know, you generally want to know if 2 deities share a domain. You want to know, you know, is it a good working relationship, or is there a rivalry of some sort there, or even, you know, an actual hatred sort of thing there. You're also going to choose 3 spells. These are spells that are granted as bonus spells to a cleric who goes into a deity or goes into that domain. So they're going to get a few extra spells from other spell traditions in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. So they might come from the occult, arcane, or primal. You do not want to be drawing bonus spells from the divine because your cleric's already going to get those divine spells. You could probably, and there may even be some instances, I don't know of any off the top of my head, but there may even be some instances where the additional spell they're getting is specifically a rare spell, so it's something that's really difficult to acquire normally by the core rules. But by choosing this deity, you get guaranteed access to it, and that's fine. It's definitely a little less interesting, maybe, but it's totally something you could do if there's a really cool rare spell and you want to make sure that all cleric followers of this deity can get access to it. Should be fine. So you want one to be a first level spell just so that your clerics are getting that benefit immediately. You're also going to want to have 2 more that will be not the same level. You don't want them to all be one level. You want them to be different levels, all of them. And they will typically be up to about 6th level. I don't think I've ever seen one higher than 6th level. So, and again, you want that because you want them to be things that your players will get access to as soon as possible, because they're just things that help differentiate their characters from other religious characters. If you're using the same spell list, but you've got a few that nobody else has, that makes you feel extra special. So you want them to be things that they can get before super high level. You might also, and this is not required, but you might also pick a few boons or curses. Again, these can be found in the Pathfinder 2nd edition Gods and Magic book, but there's also a free web supplement that got put out that you can download that has some boons and curses for some of the non-featured deities from that book. They just didn't have room, but thought of some cool ideas and wanted to include them. And there's usually a minor, a moderate, and a greater, or a minor, moderate, and major boon and curse. So they sort of get boons get better as you go, and curses get worse as you go. And you want to think about those really thematically. They're things you don't need to have, but you could. It's just going to add flavor. It's going to be a fun, cool thing that you can give to your religious players. And it's something that can just make your world feel a little more alive, especially someone who's not actively pursuing that deity, but you happen to realize, like, hey, even though this character is not religious, they sure do keep doing these things that I know this deity would really like and appreciate, so maybe they'll still just get this sort of boon. Or, maybe they're really going against some deity's wishes, and then either way, it's a whole big additional plot hook and something really fun. So that's a crash course sort of for creating a deity in this case, Pathfinder 2nd edition, but most of these rules, besides the list of what you need for your game, is going to be universal across other games. You want to find deities that exist, look at what has been done there on the official rules, and then sort of mimic that, but make it your own by finding, either inspiration elsewhere or, totally making it up. That's definitely fine too. But this is a lot of fun. I really like doing this because it makes my world feel more unique, and it makes it feel a little more engaging to the players, especially when as they get higher level and these deities start to interact with them or they start to seek them out, and especially when we're going into our second campaign in my homebrew world for this group. And so they're seeing, how times are going forward. They're sort of making their decisions on the world, and having these familiar concepts of these deities and things like that really just make them feel more immersed as they keep coming back to it. And they say, what's going on with this deity? Any big changes since the last time we were here, sort of thing. And so it can really be a lot of fun and just a great generator for hooks to get both the characters and your players as well hooked into the world. If they've got a deity that they're invested in, especially if it's one that they helped create specifically for their character, they're going to be that much more invested in your game. So that's it for the video. I hope you learned something and enjoyed yourself. If there's any questions you have about creating deities or anything like that, you can definitely let us know down in the comments, or you can come hang out in our Discord. There's a link in the description. We're always hanging out there. We have homebrew channels and just general discussions. All sorts of nerdy fun happens over there. So come visit, come hang out. Thank you so much. We'll see you next time. Welcome to the Collective.